Rishi Sunak has said that his government can and will cut taxes, but tempered expectations ahead of Wednesday's autumn statement by admitting that we can't do everything all at once.
Now, I want to cut taxes. I believe in cutting taxes. What clearer expression could there be of my governing philosophy than the belief that people and not governments make the best decisions about their money? But doing that responsibly is hard. We must avoid doing anything that puts at risk our progress in controlling inflation. And no matter how much we might want them to, history shows that tax cuts don't automatically pay for themselves.
Prime Minister refused to be drawn on specific measures the Chancellor will announce on Wednesday, but declared tax cuts one of his 5 new longer-term pledges. Now he's successfully halved inflation. Joining me in the studio is our chief political commentator, Peter Cardwell. Good to see you, Peter.
Hi.
And down the line, we're joined by Alex Crowley, the former advisor to Boris Johnson, and Times columnist and former MP Matthew Parris. I'm so delighted to have Matthew Parris on the show. I think I'll start with him as a matter of obeisance, really. So glad to have you, Matthew. People have suggested all day that Rishi Sunak is essentially muscling in on Jeremy Hunt's, I don't know, whatever is going to be reflected gloriously upon him after the autumn statement. Do you think that's the case?
Well, it must be very difficult to be Chancellor of the Exchequer when the Prime Minister is the Chancellor of the Exchequer who came before you and knows all about it. But I think that they must be assuming that Jeremy Hunt's statement is going to please a few people, and if it's going to please a few people, the Prime Minister wants to be personally associated with it. And I imagine he is. I don't imagine Jeremy Hunt will lift a finger without Rishi Sunak's permission.
It was a rather peculiar speech, though, because it kind of implied generosity and munificence, while at the same time talking about the cost of such generosity and munificence. The idea of giving a speech saying, we think we'll do it, but it's going to be inordinately expensive. Tax cuts don't always pay for themselves, you know. Well, nobody asked him to make the speech. He didn't have to mention them at all. What is the conclusion here, do you think?
I agree. There is something a little odd about the whole thing. And I think at the root of this is that if there were not a general election coming up next year, I don't think at this moment a government would be making any tax cuts. They would be waiting for a little while. We haven't got inflation down yet to the levels for which we're aiming. So in a sense, this has a bit of a whiff of pre-election about it, and the Prime Minister wanting to tell everybody what he wants to do without actually doing very much, because I don't suppose Jeremy Hunt is going to do very much. We can't afford it at the moment, and the one thing the government wants to avoid is to feed inflation. And most tax cuts, not all of them, but most tax cuts feed inflation.
It was suggested, wasn't it, that it might be inheritance tax that Jeremy Hunt would cut. In fact, it was suggested that he might get rid of it altogether or something of that ilk. Today,
yes,
there's an awful lot of suggestion that won't play well, that the gallery won't much like that, not at a time of real financial privation for many. The idea that the more fortunate would be helped rather than the least fortunate. So do you think that's not one that's going to go over big?
You don't have to be a genius to know that it's not going to play very well to reduce a tax which is really only paid by the richer section of society at a time of considerable privation and households under an awful lot of pressure. I think this suggests that one of the other things that's going to come with Jeremy Hunt's statement, he has to decide, the Chancellor can decide, which of 2 rates of inflation to increase welfare benefits by, a higher one or a lower one. I suspect he's going to choose the lower one. And if he was, as it were, somewhat reducing in real terms welfare benefits at the same time as abolishing inheritance tax, that would have looked dreadful. So that's my guess, is that what he has, as it were, given with one hand, not abolishing inheritance tax, he may take with the other, a slight cut in welfare benefits.
Let me bring Peter into this. So set the scene for us. The preemptive speech, the kind of precursor of the autumn statement. Is this a thing? Are we used to this, or is this just one of Rishi's revolutions?
Well, certainly Rishi Sunak is trying to take the focus of this autumn statement, get us to talk about it certainly a couple of days before it happens, but also to distract us, I think, from all of the other political events of last week. It was interesting, I was asked on Wednesday morning, do you think Rishi Sunak will have a good day now that inflation is down to 4.6%, to which I said I think I'll have a good 3 hours, because the Rwanda judgment's coming. Last week, about 3 years of politics happened in a few days. So Rishi Sunak wants to wrest back the narrative, talk about this, talk about tax cuts, which is the part of politics that he is very comfortable with. He is the Chancellor, of course, who put £400 billion into not just furlough, but all sorts of COVID recovery measures during the lockdown. And he is saying in this speech today that we've got to remember that we've got to pay that off at some point. That money doesn't come from nowhere, whilst at the same time there is this what's called fiscal headroom, essentially extra money of about £25 billion. So that will go, I think, into a very, what in politics they call retail, a very straightforward, easy to understand tax cut, probably on income tax or national insurance. I think the inheritance tax, for example, I think won't happen. And I think Matthew's right in that the lower uprating of benefits will be put forward. So, I mean, it's interesting as well because the autumn statement isn't the really big one. The really big one is the budget in the spring, and that will be closer to an election. So both Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak have to hold something back, and then they've got to give a lot more in the spring budget.
Alex Crowley, give me some idea of the conversations going on behind the scenes in the build-up to the autumn statement. What sorts of considerations, arguments and general conversation will be occurring at this point?
Well, they will be very mindful of the fact that a large number of Conservative MPs, Conservative supporters and Conservative voters have been looking at this last period of Conservative government going back to 2019, it should be argued. And they've thought, well, hang on, there isn't very much Conservative about this. And obviously tax is the most symbolic element of that. And so it was very interesting to see the Prime Minister stand up today and at least rhetorically nail his colours to the tax-cutting mast without, as we said, really giving any much detail about that. But it's very interesting. If we zoom out a little bit, the Conservative Party is in a dilemma. It had a new electoral coalition in 2019, which wasn't there before. It was a coalition between basically your posh southern areas and your working class northern areas, to generalise. Now people are saying that this government appears to be more about the posh southern areas than it does about the working class northern areas. And so the autumn statement is at least one opportunity to demonstrate to those voters and the Conservative base in general that they haven't forgotten that part of the coalition. That's why probably the inheritance tax cut thing is off the table. Although I would note that even working class voters look at inheritance tax and they see it as a symbol of unfairness in the tax system, even though a cut to it doesn't benefit them personally. And that's something that we see in focus groups all the time. And so that's probably where that fit into the conversation. But if you've got some headroom in the finances, then you want to cut the tax that, as Peter says, is the most retail.
We can hear from Jeremy Hunt speaking earlier today.
Sorry, Vanessa, I've just lost your audio, so I can't hear.
When having made progress on inflation, we want to focus on the long-term growth of the British economy. You are all business people. You understand that Rome wasn't built in a day. We're not going to get there immediately. I won't be able to do every single thing on the list that you've asked me to do. But I hope you will look at Wednesday's measures and apply to those measures the same definitions of success as you would apply to your own businesses. And that is to say, what matters is not the headlines you grab on the next day, but are these the measures that are going to make a real difference in the next 5 years?
Matthew Parris, I suppose the question is, are Jeremy Hunt's measures going to make any difference, not in the next 5 years, but in the forthcoming general election? Is there anything the man can do, any conjuring or sorcery that he can enlist that you think will restore the fallen fortunes of the Tory party?
Well, I do think there's a hint of desperation, which perhaps explains what you were saying right at the beginning, that this all looks rather odd, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor muscling in on what's a relatively minor statement. they've tried everything. You know, they've even got David Cameron as Foreign Secretary, and still the party is horribly behind in the polls. And I sense that at Conservative HQ, they're beginning to think nothing is going to move the dial. We might as well try anything. And tax cuts will be part of it, but Sunak is a responsible politician, and he has very little room, and really Jeremy Hunt has very little room. That 25 billion headroom isn't very much, very little room to do anything, but they're going to try to do something, anything, to get themselves a bit up in the polls.
Let me bring Peter Caldwell in, because there's been a development that people might not know has occurred, and if anyone's going to tell them, they can't. You'll have to explain why.
Indeed. Well, there is apparently a catastrophic IT failure which has happened in Parliament this afternoon within the last hour or so. We have various people tweeting and giving me information about this, including Michael Fabricant, the Conservative MP, who simply says there's been a catastrophic IT failure across Parliament. I'm unable to receive or send emails or phone calls at the present time, and other people, lots of other people reporting that as well. The authorities have said they're working to fix it, but certainly there will be lots of worries. We don't know exactly what's happening at the moment, but there will be lots of worries of a possible cyber attack from Russia or China. Well,
absolutely. Just fling in Russia and China is just to get, as if people weren't agitated enough. It gives you something else to worry about. I mean, the idea that it's actually catastrophic not to hear from Michael Fabricant for a couple of hours.
We've got him on Twitter. It's okay. It's all right, Vanessa.
Is that I shouldn't panic too much? I don't know whether universal horror and, you know, the throwing up of hands is going, or whether people are rather relieved.
I know you're upset.
Well, let's ask Matthew Parris how he feels about it. An IT failure, Matthew, in Parliament, and shock horror. No emails from Michael Fabricant for a while. How do you feel?
Anything that stops me hearing from or seeing Michael Fabricant is a personal tragedy.
Very elegantly said. I don't know if Alex Crowley can hear us. I know he's having trouble receiving us. Maybe he's being cyber attacked by the Russians or the Chinese. Maybe live on television on TalkTV. Can you hear me, Alex?
Yes, I can. I will not be silenced.
Don't you be. Don't you be. You can't hear from Michael Fabricant, however. How are you feeling about that? Do we need to send somebody with sal volatile? If we do, we will.
I mean, the hearing that crushing news from Peter right now has really ruined my day, I have to say. Yeah. To not be able to hear from the great Michael Fabricant is a tragedy indeed.
Well, I know it is very difficult, and I probably should have warned our listeners and viewers a little earlier, and I should have delivered that information in more soothing a tone, I feel. Matthew Parris, it's been a delight. Alex, lovely to see you. Thank you so much, Peter.